It's so wonderful to come together on this beautiful evening and to share these amazing stories with you. And I have to tell you, they are piling up. And it is amazing what is coming out of the woodwork. People who have been sitting on secrets for such a long time. Extraordinary stories that are absolutely unbelievable. And I have got so many of them lined up for you to listen to that you're just going to love. And those are one of the stories that I have lined up for you tonight. And so if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because you don't want to miss out on these amazing stories. And if you do happen to write a comment and I don't get back to you, please don't get upset about it. It's because I have a very hectic life and I have a puppy at the moment that is literally ripping my house to shreds and darting after the cats, and I've got lots of cats, and my dog is just being quite a nightmare, so that's very hard to control at the moment. Anyway, the story tonight comes from a lovely lady called Jeanette, who lives somewhere in North America, and she said her encounter happened in 1987, and it was because she grew up in a very, very volatile home with a very abusive mother and father who were both addicted to substances. And as a result, she couldn't wait to get out of that environment. And in doing so, she had a Bigfoot encounter. And this is what she's sharing with us today. And you are going to love the story. I know I did. So let's get started. Dear Sarah, my name is Jeanette, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in the year 1987, somewhere here in North America, but I don't want to say exactly where. Let me tell you my story, though, and how I came to encounter the hairy man, otherwise known as Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I grew up in a very abusive household. My mother was always high on drugs, and my father was a shameless alcoholic. I was an only child, and I grew up feeling ashamed of both of my parents. I'm afraid to say they were a huge embarrassment to me. I was frightened to tell anybody what was going on in my household because I was so terrified that social services would get involved in my situation. And I truly did not fancy the idea of being one of those children that hopped from one foster home to another. I knew of situations like that, and they weren't good stories. I really believed that even though I was in a bad situation, if I went and lived in a foster home, I would be far worse off than with my dysfunctional parents. It was normal for me to come home to literally find my mother passed out on drugs, lying on the couch, completely spaced out in another world. And then my father I would find watching sports games on television in a drunken stupor. I remember that the living room became like a dumping ground for battered beer cans and leftover takeaways. It was disgusting. Sometimes I felt like I was the only adult in my house. With the money from my paper round, I would buy my own food and anything else that I might need. Otherwise, there was nothing in the house. My parents lived off state disability benefits, which they managed to claim, I don't know how. And most of these benefits were spent on alcohol and drugs. My mother was as skinny as a rake because she just took drugs and barely ever ate a thing. I sometimes wonder why she was still alive because she was so emaciated and her skin was pale and pasty and grey, dulled by the substance abuse. She would have looked perfect playing a part on those zombie movies because she looked just like one of them. So much so, in fact, that she could have been given the leading part. My dad was also extremely thin and emaciated, but his stomach was the size of a pregnant woman who was expecting triplets because his liver was so badly inflamed and he was already suffering from the early stages of cirrhosis of the liver. The side effects of this alcohol abuse made him aggressive and abusive and sometimes even violent. And some of the nasty things he said to me are not repeatable to any of your listeners. When I would go home, I would go to my bedroom and lock the door behind me because I wanted as little contact with my parents as possible. I would always look forward to going to school and would eagerly catch the earliest bus in the morning. I remember always dreading the school holidays because it meant that I was shut in the house with two very insane parents that I hated being around. I adored my school friends, and I would dread coming home from school every single day. I would literally have to pace myself before I opened the front door, because I never knew what I would find. Maybe my mother would be wobbling around the house, speaking in a slurred voice, or she might even be dead. Nothing would have surprised me. I was the girl at school with the holes in my socks and wearing the faded dress that was way too short that I had outgrown a long time ago. Luckily, I had the nicest friends. They never commented about the state of my clothes or how old they were, nor did they ask me any awkward questions, but they would have been blind not to notice how impoverished I was. I envied my friends with their perfectly packed lunch boxes, their new-looking clothes, and their seemingly perfect lives. If I went to a friend's house for a birthday party or some other occasion, I was just so shocked how some people had the most wonderful lives and parents who loved and adored them and looked out for their best interests. Sometimes my friends would be mad about being grounded or something, and I would think how lucky they were to have parents who truly loved them and enough to set boundaries. Mine never cared a jot about what I did. Even though I was sad about my plight, I did not allow it to get me down or to discourage me in any way. I tried to be as resourceful as I could to make money as a young girl by offering my services to neighbours in doing odd jobs like washing cars or weeding the garden or even painting something, which they would pay me for. I would never get any money from my parents. As for my family home, it was an embarrassment and a sight to behold. I think our nearest neighbour did not like living next door to our house because it was literally falling apart, with shabby, dirty curtains and threadbare furniture, and an overgrown garden that had not seen a lawnmower for years, while their gardens, by contrast, were beautifully manicured and maintained, with perfectly mown lawns and beds of beautiful blooming flowers. I could not wait until I finally was old enough to legally leave home and get a job all of my own to support myself. When that day did finally arrive and I got a job as a waitress at a restaurant in the town that was always so busy because the food was so delicious, and they were open until late in the evening, they made the best burgers in town and the most delicious smoked meat sandwiches you've ever tasted. I was so excited about my future prospects. I could not afford a place of my own, but I had learnt from a friend of mine of a house that had been recently abandoned for a pretty long while. And yet the good news was the power was still working, which was extraordinary. The house was fairly close to where I attended school, so everything looked pretty promising. I was so desperate to leave my home and all that unhappiness and desperate loneliness behind me that I had felt growing up. I decided that I would move into this abandoned house and clean it up as much as I possibly could until I could finally afford to rent out my own place. In other words, I was about to become a squatter, I suppose, a word I've never liked. I took a trip in a bus that stopped almost yards away from the abandoned house that I hadn't visited before. I had left a note for my parents telling them that I had left home for good and had no intention of coming back, and that I hoped they had great lives. I doubt that they would have even cared that I had left or even noticed that much for that matter. All I had with me was a bag of cleaning products, a little food and a suitcase filled with second-hand clothing that I had recently bought from a thrift shop, which was a much better upgrade than any of my old clothes. When I arrived at the property, I was shocked by how overgrown it was. I wasn't expecting it to be this bad. It truly was a rambling thicket of vegetation that had definitely seen better days. There were lots of trees on the property that ended up becoming more uniform towards the northern side, looking like it bordered out into a larger wooded area. The surrounding valleys and countryside in the distance were all densely forested, and I knew that there were lakes, streams, and plentiful wildlife in the area, from white-tailed deers to hogs and the usual predators that you get in these parts. The house was a very long bungalow that was spacious, but a lot of the furniture had been removed, but there still were odds and ends lying around the place that had clearly belonged to the previous owner. The house was big enough for a whole family, but I just got the impression it had belonged to a single man, and I could not help wondering why he had left and abandoned this lovely home of his. I saw an old photograph of a gentleman in a frame that lay upside down on the floor, and I picked it up and looked at it, imagining that this was the man who had once owned the house. The picture was that of a handsome-looking man in his early 30s who appeared to be wearing tennis shoes and holding a racket in his hands. I really got the impression that he looked like a nice bloke who was a little bit on the shy side. The kitchen area was extremely impressive and looked almost new, with its fancy wooden cupboards, central island and fancy gas hob. When I went to the main room, where there was no furniture at all, as if the whole room had been cleared out completely, so much so in fact that I swear I could smell the telltale signs of heavy-duty cleaning materials that still lingered in the air. Suddenly I felt this awful sense of foreboding, and I just knew instinctively that something remarkably bad had happened here. But what it was, I couldn't say. Then I saw it. The very thing that confirmed my worst nightmare about this bedroom. On an area of floor, marking what I imagine was where a dead body had once lain, were the telltale signs of that yellow tape with black writing saying crime scene. I could see what appeared to be an area on the wooden floor that almost looked like a stain from what may have been a decomposing body or maybe a blood stain of some kind. I did not know. I also found a piece of paper that may have been written by a medical examiner or a police officer lying on the floor. Most of the note I did not understand, but there was one sentence that got my attention almost immediately, and it said, "Large laceration to the side of the neck." I knew that something bad had transpired in this house, and that someone had clearly been murdered. But why was the house still abandoned? In that moment, I did feel that sense of impending doom and desire to leave this place almost at once. But no matter how tarnished this place may be, I just knew that going home was not an option for me. You would think I would just get back on the bus and go back home, but you would need to understand how desperate I was to get away from my awful parents. I had dreamt of this day for so long, and I was not about to give up on my dreams, not even now. Even though someone was murdered on this premises, nothing was going to stop me from making this a roof over my heads for the next few months until I had saved enough money to rent out my own place. I just closed the crime scene room and decided never to venture in there ever again. But I spent the next few days cleaning the rest of the house. I scrubbed the whole place from top to bottom until my hands ached with pain. I cleaned windows and washed floors and hoovered carpets because the electrics were still working. The place was beginning to feel more like a home, and it was a wonderful feeling to be away from my parents, and for the first time in my life, I began to feel free. One day while I was busy cleaning, I heard a young girl sobbing outside. She was sitting on the front porch, and I did not know whether to go out and comfort her or to remain hidden inside the abandoned house. I had no idea who she was or what she was doing on the property, and I did wonder why she was crying. Eventually I decided to go out onto the wooden deck to comfort the girl who was sitting on one of the steps. "Are you all right?" I asked. "I just heard you crying." "I suppose I am what you..." The girl looked startled. "Who are you?" she asked. "I suppose I'm what you might call a squatter," I said. "I'm kind of living here." "Are you kidding?" she said, wiping away her tears. "You do know what happened here." "Someone was murdered, you know." "Well," I said, "I did see some crime tape in the bedroom, so I guess someone had been found dead here." The girl looked at me with a puzzled expression on her face. "You would live in a place like this after knowing that someone was killed violently here?" she asked. I was surprised by my own frank response. "Well, I'm desperate," I exclaimed. "You must be," said the girl, looking at me startled. "You'd have to pay me to live in Uncle Matt's home after what happened to him." "Was this your Uncle Matt's home?" I asked in surprise. "Was it him who died in that room?" The girl nodded, and then she burst into uncontrollable sobs. "Get it all out," I said to her, cradling her into my arms and stroking her back. "Crying is the best way to heal," I told her. After the girl stopped sobbing, she looked up at me and said, "Why him of all people? He was the nicest person I have ever known. Who would want to do such an evil thing to him?" "I saw his picture," I said. "He looked like an incredibly nice guy." "I found him, you know," said the girl. "I always popped in to see him once or twice a week." The girl proceeded to tell me how the front door had been taken off its hinges, almost as if it had been yanked off by some violent force. "The police have never seen anything like this before," she exclaimed. "They said the break-ins do not happen like this." She proceeded to tell me how she knew when she saw the front door on the ground that something quite dreadful had happened to her uncle. He had only been dead for 4 hours when I found him, but the smell in that room was intolerable. I never knew a dead body could smell like a skunk. It was disgusting. Anyway, she continued, "I rushed into his room and he was lying on the ground, motionless. I knew he was dead. His neck was broken with a huge gash on the side." "Wow," I said, "that's terrible. I'm so sorry for your loss." "I came here today," said the girl, "to make sense of everything, and of course to remember him, to be close to him, because this is where I spent time with him." "Of course you did," I said. "I'll get out of your way." "Please don't," the girl begged. "It's good to talk to someone about this." "Did your uncle say anything about any enemies?" I asked her curiously. "Maybe someone who wanted to do him grievous bodily harm?" "Can I tell you something weird?" she said. "In the strictest of confidence, of course." "Of course," I said. "Go on. I'm all ears." "Well, I don't know how to say this, and I know it's going to sound very strange, but it's really true. There was this very large man on the property once. I was with my uncle when I saw him. We both actually saw him. The only thing about him was that he was much bigger than a man would be. I've never seen a man that big. And he was covered with short black hair. We both saw him watching us from the tree line over there, and he was like a savage. He looked menacing and very scary, you know, like an apex predator. He had this strange conical head and very long arms compared to ours. He also thumped his chest in front of us very aggressively, as if to tell us, you know, I'm boss, not you. And he made this deep guttural sound, which was the most terrifying sound that either my uncle and I had ever heard. "Did you tell the police about this?" I asked. "I tried to, but when I did, they just laughed at me, as if they thought I was making it all up. I want to find the killer as much as they do, but they didn't take me seriously at all." "Oh dear," I said, "that's terrible." "Did you ever see the big hairy man again?" I asked. "No, but my uncle saw him from time to time, and he said things were getting seriously out of hand with the creature. He said that horrible hairy man had been banging his house and even throwing boulders at his front door and got him feeling incredibly intimidated." "Are you sure about this?" I asked in horror, wondering whether squatting at this property was such a good idea after all. "You haven't seen any sightings of this hairy man again?" she asked me. "I'm willing to bet that he killed my uncle, and if he's still around, you could also be in danger. You realise that? I mean, this thing was a monster, and I'm not kidding you about that. I don't know if you're actually safe here." She started to hand me a bottle of mace. "I brought it along in case I had any nasty encounters of my own," she said. "But I think if you're going to be staying here, you're going to need it more than I do." I took the bottle of mace from the girl gratefully. "You will come back?" I asked. "I've really enjoyed our chat." The girl nodded, and I watched her walk away. What an extraordinary story, I thought. 3 weeks passed by in the abandoned house, and I was thrilled that the electric still had not been cut off. It was wonderful leaving my parents and living all on my own. I had been saving a lot of money, and things were going exceedingly well for me. Every night after my waitressing stint, I would return home at about 12 o'clock and was given a lift by one of the waitresses that worked with me, who had her own car. One evening as I returned to the abandoned house, I sensed that something was watching me, and whatever it was incredibly unsettling. Suddenly I detected a movement in the brush of this dark, shadowy form with bright red eyes, at least 7 feet off the ground. I ran into the house and immediately bolted the doors and windows from the inside. Luckily, even the keys of the house were lying around, and the front door had long since been fixed, so at least I knew I was safely secure on the inside of the house. The thing, whatever it was, came thundering through the tree line like a bulldozer, and I could hear his heavy feet walking across the roof. He was making the most horrendous growls that were so terrifying I nearly jumped through my skin. My heart was pounding, and I could do nothing to call for help because there were no phones on the property, and in those days we didn't have cell phones accessible to us. I've never felt so vulnerable and so afraid in all of my life, and I could hear this thing banging and pounding the front door, and suddenly I heard the hinge breaking, and I knew that this thing was after me. He would be in the house in seconds, and I knew I was in grave danger of losing my life. I remember that there was a bathroom window in the back that I believed I was slim enough to slide through, and so that is what I did. It is amazing what you can do when you are in grave danger. I suddenly heard the front door breaking off its hinges, and by that time I'd slipped out of the house as quietly as I could. I ran into the main road, and I was fortunate enough to flag down a passing driver, which was a miracle because it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and there were not many drivers out on the roads that late at night. The stranger asked me no awkward questions and proceeded to drop me at my parents' house. I kid you not, when I walked back into my family home, my parents barely acknowledged me, barely asked where I'd been, and did not even realize, I think, that I'd been living away from that home for several weeks. I never even returned to the abandoned house ever again, nor did I ever see the lovely niece of the deceased Uncle Matt. I had left all my minimal belongings in the house, including all my savings, but I knew I would never go back to get them. I am convinced that it was that creature killed the owner of the abandoned house, which I believe was a territorial Bigfoot who did not want anyone on the property. When he got a whiff of my presence, he was after me too, and I have no doubt that he would have killed me if he had got hold of me. I was so lucky to escape with my life, and for that I am truly grateful. It took me 2 long years to finally move out of my parents' house, but eventually within months of each other, they both died because of their addictive behaviours. My mother died of substance overdose, and my father eventually succumbed to cirrhosis of the liver. I am happily married now with children of my own, and I truly cannot understand why my parents were so irresponsible and so incredibly uncaring. But I have forgiven them, as I have that hairy man, for attempting to harm me, because in my experience, carrying grudges can poison you very much and cause you too much grief in your own life. And I wanted to move on from all of that. So there you are. That's my story. Jeanette, I know that this is a very hard story for you have to shared with anyone tonight. I cannot imagine what it must have been to actually move into a crime scene home and consider that preferable where someone's being murdered than staying with your own parents. That really does bring to light how awful it is to live with people who are addicted to substances like alcohol and drugs. I cannot imagine what you went through as a young girl, and I truly applaud you for your incredible courage. And I just thank you so much also for having the incredible courage to send us this amazing story that really tugs at the heartstrings. Until next time, goodbye and good night.